Hi, dear friends, some words of Torah for Parshat Chukas. Bring them home. Our hearts are still filled with anxiety over the dozens of hostages still languishing in Gaza tunnels. We are praying, doing mitzvot, wearing tags, and attending rallies regularly. But this is not the first time in our history when we've had to deal with rescuing hostages. I recently read a Devar Torah from 1976, where the writer was noting how the hostage rescue from Entebbe coincided with this parsha. Parshat Chukas introduces us to the final year of the Jews' 40-year sojourn in the desert. As the nation approached the Promised Land, Bnei Israel began to confront belligerent forces who attempted to prevent their entry into the land. One such episode is tersely mentioned without much detail. Immediately after Aharon passed away, the Torah tells us that Vayishma HaKenaani, one of the Canaanite kings in the Negev, heard of the Jews' journey toward Eretz Yisrael, and that they were traveling Derech HaAtarim, which can be translated as via the same path that the spies had traveled some 40 years before. Noting that the nation was planning to invade their country using the spies' recommended path, they began a war with the Israelites. What were the effects of this war? Firstly, the Torah says, Vayishb mimenu shevi. The Canaanites took captives, although it's unclear whom they captured and how many captives there were. As a result of this blow, the Jewish people took a vow to Hashem. Im naton titene ta'am hazeh biyadi. If you place this nation into our hand, then we will consecrate their entire city and its contents to you. Hashem acceded to their prayer, and the Canaanites were destroyed and despoiled. Curiously, the Torah doesn't say a word about the captives and their fate. We might assume that the captives were saved by the Jewish enemy, as is suggested by the Midrash. But why is there no word about this in the text? Wouldn't we think that getting back the captives would have been the top priority for the army, even a higher priority than destroying the Canaanites? This is not the only place in Tanakh when we read about the captives in a time of war. Back in Parshat Lech Lecha, Avraham's nephew Lot was captured by the four kings and taken captive, together with many others from the city of Sodom. In that narrative, the Torah is quite explicit about Avraham's primary goal of retrieving the captives, and that he successfully saved Lot and the other inhabitants of Sodom. In that story, saving the hostages seems to be the highlight and the whole purpose of the war. Another story about captives is from the first book of Samuel, chapter 30, wherein Amalek attacked a town in Israel called Ziklag. The attackers kidnapped the women and children, including two of King David's wives. David was extremely aggrieved and immediately assembled an army. He attacked the Amalekite encampment and succeeded in retrieving all the captives alive. There, too, the highlight of the story and the very reason for the war was to rescue the hostages. Why then is this information not provided in our story? We have no clue as to the fate of the hostages. In truth, our sages minimize the importance of who was taken captive. Rashi cites from the Midrash that the Canaanites kidnapped only one handmaid, someone of social insignificance. But I find this somewhat dissatisfying, for after all, is not every Jew, even the lowliest handmaid, worth saving? Isn't every Jew holy and special? Further, Targum Yonatan states that numerous hostages were taken, in contrast with Rashi. Let's first note that our sages tell us that the attackers in the desert were actually not Canaanites, the indigenous people of the land. Rather, they were Amalekites, masquerading as Canaanites. They only pretended to be the indigenous people so that they could rationalize their offensive to the world. We suggest that the reason why the captive or captives are never heard from again is because Amalek was as cruel as ever before. They were not attacking the Jews because they were fearful that their land would be seized by the Jews, since Amalek was not indigenous to Eretz Yisrael. Rather, their seething hatred of seeing a new nation of people rise up from slavery and become so successful so rapidly made them exceedingly jealous, and they could not bear for such a successful nation to live near them. They therefore captured hostages not for the purpose of holding them ransom or enslaving them, but rather in order to torture the Jewish people by executing the hostages. The hostages are never heard from again in our story because tragically they did not survive the ordeal. As a result, the only aftermath of the story is the destruction of the Amalekite camp, who unleashed this gratuitous and senseless violence. Rav Pinchas Horowitz of Chortkov writes something truly astounding. In Parshat Ki Teitzei, we read about the mitzvah of Zachor, remember what Amalek did to you. 2 phrases are used in that text to describe what Amalek did. Remember what Amalek did to you when leaving Egypt, Baderech b'tzeitechem Mitzrayim. This refers to the events in Parshat Bishalach, when Amalek attacked shortly after we crossed the Red Sea. But then it says, Asher korecha baderech, they came upon you on the way. And according to Rav Horowitz, this refers to a separate episode, the events of our Parsha, when Amalek attacked us as we were on our way, baderech, toward Eretz Yisrael. That is, part of the mitzvah of remembering Amalek's evil is to remember how they pretended to be the indigenous people of the land, pretending that they were merely protecting their ancestral homeland, when in reality their insidious behavior was born from jealousy. It also reminds us to remember how they took our captives and how their fates remain unrecorded, because the objective was not to keep them alive, but rather to torture the Jewish people only further. We will never forget this. We must remember Amalek and their descendants. Let's also remember that the remedy against Amalek was when Bnei Yisrael turned their hearts and their prayers to God, asking Hashem for divine aid and mercy, and promising to consecrate the spoils for God. We must do the same through our continued prayers, even though the events of October 7 are over 9 months old. We must not let down our guard, nor may we cease our prayers. Let us continue our acts of kindness and live our lives with the hostages always in our minds, with purpose and gratitude. We must soldier forward together with our soldiers on the ground until we too can fulfill the utter destruction of Amalek's descendants. May Hashem spare our remaining hostages, and may He minimize the civilian casualties to whatever degree possible. Dear friends, let's see redemption and peace. Bimheira, b'yameinu, amen. Wishing you a beautiful Shabbos. Shabbat Shalom.